Now, this is quite a discovery. Fragments of a biblical scroll, along with other relics, have been found in desert caves in Israel. Right now, in a room you will never be invited into, a handful of scholars are sitting on something they are terrified to say out loud. In 2024, they fed the Dead Sea Scrolls into an artificial intelligence and let it read for 96 hours straight. When it finished, nobody celebrated. They went quiet. They started meeting behind closed doors, and they have not stopped since. Because the machine did not just read the oldest Bible on earth. It read what was hidden inside it. The things no human eye had ever been able to find. Music. And once you see what it found, you will understand exactly why these people are so afraid to tell you. What were they doing in these caves? Who put them here? Why did they put them here? The rock that didn't echo. He was looking for a lost goat. When he came to the entrance to a cave, he decided to throw a stone into the cave to see if he could flush out the goat. It started with a lost goat. Spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib was climbing through the cliffs above the Dead Sea, hunting for an animal that had wandered off. To scare it out of a cave, he threw a rock into the dark, and the rock did not echo the way a rock thrown into an empty cave is supposed to echo. It cracked against something hollow, pottery. So he climbed inside, and in that darkness, he found 7 clay jars sealed with wax. Stop and put yourself in that cave for a second. A shepherd alone. No idea he is standing in the most important spot in modern archaeology. 7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public. Staring at 7 sealed jars that have not been opened since before the time of Christ. Music did not know it. He could not have known it. He was looking for a goat. Now, here is what was inside those jars. The most important archaeological find of the entire 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Roughly 25,000 fragments of leather, parchment, and papyrus. The oldest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible. Texts that predated the version of Scripture used by every modern Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition by more than 1,000 years. Writings nobody alive had laid eyes on in 2,000 years. I want you to sit with what that shepherd music cracked open. It was not just a cave. It was a window into what the Bible looked like before 2,000 years of translation and revision turned it into the book you know today. And here's the part nobody likes to talk about. For 75 years after that goat ran into that cave, we could barely read what he found. The fragments are tiny. The text is faded to nothing. The scholarship is scattered across dozens of institutions, dozens of languages, and dozens of agendas that do not always agree. So, picture the situation honestly. A scholar in one country spends a decade on a single column of text, arguing in journals over whether a faded smudge is a letter or a flaw in the leather. And the fragment that would have finished that exact sentence is sitting in a sealed archive on another continent, photographed once, filed under a different number, never connected music to the work being done 1,000 miles away. The pieces of the puzzle were never in the same room. They were never even in the same conversation. For decades, nobody could be sure how much of the picture was even still missing. And it is worse than just distance. Some of those fragments are smaller than your thumbnail. The ink on them is the color of the leather around it. A single scrap might carry 3 letters, and those 3 letters might belong to a word that changes the meaning of an entire verse. If you could only figure out which word and which verse, and which of the thousands of other scraps it once sat beside, that is the job. 3 letters at a time for 75 years. That was the wall the entire field had been slammed against for 3/4 of a century. The evidence survived. The fragments survived. But no human music mind could hold all of it at once, reference all of it at once, compare every faded stroke against every other faded stroke in the whole collection. The limit was never the scrolls. The limit was us. Until 2024, a research music team working across 3 universities fed the entire archive into a deep learning model. Music trained specifically on ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek manuscript handwriting. Every fragment, every photograph, every infrared and multispectral scan ever taken, decades of it, loaded into one system and turned loose. 96 hours later, the machine handed back its results. And that is the moment the scholars stopped talking to the press. Because what it found does not start in a comfortable university library. It starts in one of the most terrifying places in the Judean desert. We are now looking at a brave new world. A new world of Dead Sea Scroll scholarship. The Cave of Horror. They call it the Cave of Horror, and they did not name it that for fun. In 2021, Israeli archaeologists mounted an expedition into one of the most dangerous, inaccessible caves in the Judean desert. Cave 8, a site that had been partially explored decades earlier, but never fully excavated. It earned its name from what earlier expeditions found waiting inside about 40 skeletons, men, women, children. These were Jewish refugees who had hidden in that cave during the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome, somewhere around 132 to 136 CE. The Romans tracked them there, camped on the cliffs above, and simply waited. No water inside, no food, no way out. The refugees died exactly where they hid, trapped between Roman soldiers and a 250-foot drop, choosing death over surrender. Their bones stayed in that cave for nearly 1,900 years. Sit with that picture. Families pressed into the dark, listening to soldiers moving around on the rock above them, knowing nobody was coming to help, knowing the water was gone, knowing how this ends. And in those final days, with all of that closing in, some of them were still copying scripture, still guarding the words. That detail is going to matter more than you can possibly guess right now, because so did their scrolls. The 2021 expedition pulled out around 80 new scroll fragments. Tiny pieces of parchment, some no bigger than a fingernail, kept alive by nothing but the cave's brutal dryness and steady temperature. Most were too damaged to read by any normal method. Some showed text. Some showed only faint traces. Some looked completely blank until they were put under advanced imaging. But the researchers knew what they were holding. The fragments belonged to the Scroll of the 12, also called the Minor Prophet Scroll. The unique, amazing thing about this system is the amazing data captured with the system carrying material from the books of Nahum, Zechariah, and other prophetic writings. And here's the strange part. They were written in Greek, not Hebrew, not Aramaic. Greek that should not be there. The Dead Sea Scrolls are overwhelmingly Hebrew and Aramaic. Greek fragments are rare, and when they show up, they are evidence of a Jewish community that had taken on the language of the wider Mediterranean world. A community reading and guarding its scripture and translation. And remember where this particular Greek was found. Not in a library, not in a temple, in the cave of horror beside the bones of people who died holding it. So who were these people hiding Greek scripture in a Hebrew-speaking land, copying sacred text while an empire hunted them through the desert? For decades, the honest answer was that nobody could be sure. The fragments were too far gone. Scholars could match a few letters, propose a few reconstructions, and stop there. Certainty was impossible. They needed something stronger than human eyes and human patience. They needed a machine. Before I show you what that machine found in those fragments, do me one favor, because this next part is the reason I made this video. If a message buried by people who chose to die rather than let it disappear is worth 2,000 years of waiting, it is worth one tap on that subscribe button right now. That tap is music, the only reason this channel can keep digging these stories up. So, hit it and let me show you what the machine read off the parchment that those people died protecting, because what it saw next made the whole research team go silent. What the machine saw is a project that deals with the documentation and imaging of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The analysis started with technology that would have looked like pure science fiction a single generation ago. The fragments were scanned in visible light at multiple wavelengths, then photographed under infrared, which drags out ink that has faded to invisibility under normal light. Then examined under ultraviolet, which makes certain organic materials glow differently and exposes writing the naked eye cannot see at all. Here's why that matters so much. A fragment that looked blank, a scrap a scholar might have tossed aside as worthless, could light up under infrared, and music reveal a full line of text that had been invisible for 2,000 years. Ink fades, but it does not always vanish. It sinks into the parchment. Music, it changes. It goes undetectable to human vision while still leaving a fingerprint that the right wavelength, music, of light can pull back to the surface. The imaging did not add a single thing to the scrolls. It revealed what was already there waiting. And I want you to really feel that, because it is almost unbearable when you think about it. The words, music were never gone. They were sitting right there on the parchment the entire time for 2,000 years while generation after generation of scholars looked straight at them and saw nothing but blank, ruined leather. We were not missing the text because the text was lost. We were missing it because our eyes were never built to catch it. The machine simply opened a door that was already there. Then those images went into deep learning models trained on ancient manuscript handwriting systems that had already studied thousands of examples of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek scripts from the Second Temple period, learning the letter forms, the scribal habits, the tiny patterns a human reader would walk straight past. But the machine did not just read the scrolls, it rebuilt them. It found faint traces of letters that human analysts had passed over completely. It matched fragments that had been separated for decades. Pieces that physically fit together but had been filed in different collections, studied by different scholars, music, and never once recognized as parts of the same original document. It detected palsias, places where text had been erased and written over with the older version still ghosting underneath. Picture what that one ability actually means. Two scraps of parchment torn from the same line, ripped apart sometime in the last 2,000 years, end up in separate archives, separate countries, separate careers. No human ever connects them because no human can see all of it at once. Then the machine looks at the entire collection in a single pass and quietly slides the two halves back together like a sentence finishing itself after 20 centuries of silence. Words that were broken in half are suddenly whole again, and it read handwriting with a precision no human could touch. It measured the spacing between letters down to fractions of a millimeter. It picked up the pressure behind each stroke. It caught differences in how letters were formed, differences pointing to different music scribes, different time periods, and as it turned out, something nobody on the team had braced for. Let me be clear about the scale of what was happening here. A team of people who music had spent their entire careers staring at these fragments was now watching a machine do, in 96 hours, what they could not have finished in 10 lifetimes. It linked pieces they had given up on. It read lines they had written off as blank. For the researchers, that alone was the find of the century. They were already stunned. Well, you've got a lot of really important objects and the opportunity to see 10 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Really the most important archaeological discovery of our time. And then the machine flagged a section of handwriting as anomalous. And when the lead researchers pulled it up to see what had tripped the system, the room went quiet. The handwriting of fear. What the machine flagged was a section from the Book of Nahum, and the handwriting there was wrong, not different. Wrong. It was jagged, rushed, uneven. The spacing between letters lurched around. The pressure behind the strokes jumped from one word to the next. The lines drifted off horizontal. Everything about it pointed to a scribe writing fast under stress, with none of the careful control that defined every other part of the same scroll. So the analysts examined it closely. And what they were looking at was not just a different hand. It was fear. You have to understand what the machine actually measured here. It measured the space between letters down to a fraction of a millimeter. And in those measurements, it found something no chemical test and no carbon date could ever give you. It found a state of mind, the tremor in the strokes, the little hesitations where the pen had stopped dead in the middle of a word, the shaky, broken rhythm of a hand that was cold, music, or sick, or terrified. 2,000 years collapsed into the gap between two letters. And what came through that gap was not information. It was a feeling, and that is the moment the Cave of Horror stopped being a name and started being a scene. And here's what makes it cut even deeper. The machine could see the contrast. Other parts of that very same scroll were calm, controlled, steady, the work of a trained hand taking its time. Music. So, this was not a clumsy scribe or a bad copist. This was a skilled person whose hand had stopped being steady. Something had changed between one passage and the next. Something had gone wrong in the room. Think about who was actually in that cave. These were not scrolls produced in some calm scriptorium by professional scribes with all the time in the world. These were scrolls copied by people who were running, people hiding, people who knew Roman soldiers were hunting them through the desert, that their community was being wiped off the map, that everything they believed was about to be erased. And they copied their scripture anyway by lamplight in a cave with shaking hands, while the empire that was going to kill them sat camped on the cliffs over their heads. Those scrolls were never just religious artifacts. They were acts of defiance, messages from people who refused to let their faith die quietly with them. And a machine 17 centuries later caught that defiance in the strokes of the letters. The physical evidence of courage pressed straight into the parchment. So now think about being one of those researchers. You feed dry data into a model. You are expecting letter forms and date estimates. And what comes back is the hand of a terrified human being writing in the dark in the last days of their life. That is not the kind of thing you announce in a press release the next morning. That is the kind of thing you sit with in a closed room with a few other people on Earth who understand exactly what they are looking at. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the remnants of what in antiquity would have been about 900 complete scrolls. Before you dare say it out loud, you can understand now why the people studying this stopped wanting to talk. But the fear in one scroll was not the part that rattled them most. The real shock came when the machine stopped looking at single fragments and looked at all 25,000 of them at once. Not one library, but a civilization's archive. When the machine examined the entire corpus together, every fragment, every photograph, every scan piled up over 75 years, it found a pattern that knocked the legs out from under one of the most basic assumptions about where the scrolls even came from. You probably know the standard story. A Jewish sect, usually identified as the Essenes, lived in a community at Qumran, music near the caves. They copied and guarded sacred texts as part of their religious life. When Rome closed in, they hid their library in the caves. One isolated music group, one library, clean and simple. The machine made a mess of that story. The scrolls were not written by one community. They were written by dozens of different scribes, possibly hundreds, working across at least 200 years. The handwriting analysis found distinct hands scattered all through the collection. Some scribes turned up in multiple scrolls working over long careers. Others appeared once and never again. That is far more variety than any single isolated sect could ever produce. 200 years. Stop on that number. That is not a single community copying its books over one lifetime. That is people who were born, grew old, and died, handing the work to others who were not yet born when the earliest of these scrolls were written. Whole generations of hands. The machine could see them all laid out at once, like fingerprints from a crime scene that spanned 2 centuries. And then there is the language problem. The scrolls contain Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Paleo. Hebrew, an archaic script that had been out of everyday use for centuries by the time these texts were written. So ask yourself the obvious question. Why would one small, isolated community be hoarding scripture in 4 different writing systems? The machine pointed at an answer that music changes everything. The scrolls may not be one community's library at all. They may be a rescue operation. Picture it. First time in over 60 years we have fragments set of a biblical book. As Rome tightens its grip on Judea, as the temple is destroyed in 70 CE, as Jewish communities are scattered and slaughtered, sacred texts from across the whole region get gathered up and hidden in the desert caves. Not one sect's collection as civilization's archive. The last surviving pieces of a diverse Jewish literary world, stuffed into jars by people who knew their world was ending and music were desperate for anything at all to survive them. The Greek texts could be Helleized Jewish communities from the coastal cities, the Hebrew from the traditional communities around Jerusalem, the Aramaic from rural people speaking the everyday tongue of the land. Different caves, different communities, all reaching for the same darkness at the same doomed moment. Do you see how much bigger that makes this? The old story was almost cozy. One quiet sect copying its own books in peace, tucking them away when trouble came. But what the machine is describing, music is not that at all. It is the emergency salvage of an entire civilization that knew it was being wiped out. It is not one library. It is the scattered memory of a whole world hidden in the rock by dozens of different hands who never met each other and were never meant to end up side by side. Which means every fragment is a decision made under pressure. Somebody stood in front of a shelf of holy writings, knew they could not carry all of it, knew the soldiers were coming, and chose what to save and what to abandon. And once the machine understood that, it noticed something even louder than what was in the caves. It noticed what was missing, the book that isn't there, the Dead Sea. Scrolls contain fragments from almost every book of the Hebrew Bible. Almost. The book of Esther is gone. Not one single fragment of Esther has ever been identified among the 25,000 pieces. And the book of Chronicles is nearly gone, too, surviving only in the tiniest, most uncertain scraps. So why? This is what makes it strange. Esther is no minor book. It explains the origin of Purim, one of the most celebrated Jewish holidays. It tells the story of Jewish survival in exile, a theme that should have hit these communities like a hammer, given they were being hunted into caves by an empire. Of every book to leave out, this is the one that should have spoken loudest, and it simply is not there. The old explanation is that the coming community rejected Esther on theological grounds. Maybe because the book never explicitly names God, but the machine's reading of the corpus points somewhere far more human. If the scrolls are a rescue and not a finished canon, then the absence is not a verdict. It is a casualty. Follow that because it flips the whole question on its head. For generations, we read the gap as a judgment, as if some council had sat down and struck Esther from the list. But if these are the books people grabbed while fleeing for their lives, the missing book may not have been condemned at all. It may have been the one someone could not reach in time, the one they could not carry, the one left on the shelf when the choice came down to a single armful of parchment and a long, terrified climb into a hidden cave. We have been reading it as a decision. It may have been a tragedy, a book lost not because anyone hated it, but because hands can only hold so much when soldiers are coming. What they saved tells us what they valued. What they left behind tells us what they were willing to lose. But the missing books were only half of it, because when the machine turned to the books that were there, it found they did not say what they were supposed to say.